The morning Eli Fletcher walked through the front door of Sheriff Holt's office and set his revolvers on the desk without a single word of explanation. Every soul in Harlan Creek, Texas knew exactly what, or rather who, had finally brought that man to his knees. It was the year 1883, and the town of Harlan Creek sat nestled in the red dust of West Texas like a stubborn weed that refused to be pulled from dry earth. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, bringing with it a modest prosperity, a new mercantile, a proper schoolhouse, and the kind of quiet ambition that makes small towns believe in themselves. It also brought strangers, and strangers brought trouble, and trouble in Harlan Creek had, for nearly 4 years running, worn the face of Eli Fletcher. Eli was not the worst outlaw the territory had ever produced. That distinction belonged to men who killed without cause and burned what they could not steal. Eli was something more complicated and, in the eyes of many women in town, considerably more dangerous. He was the kind of man who made people feel sorry for him even as he robbed them blind. He had never killed anyone, a fact Sheriff Holt repeated often, mostly to reassure himself. Eli ran with a loose outfit of riders called the Creston Boys, named for the Creston Ravine where they kept their camp during the warmer months. They hit freight wagons, occasionally a mail coach, once a small bank 3 counties over. They were fast and they were clever, and they always seemed to vanish before anyone could properly pursue them. Eli Fletcher was 31 years old, tall as a pine in January, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the particular shade of gray that reminded people of a sky just before a storm decides what it wants to do. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who took their work seriously, and a quiet manner that deceived nearly everyone who encountered him into thinking he might be reasonable. He was reasonable in his way. That was part of the problem. Martha Doyle arrived in Harlan Creek on a Tuesday in late April, which is the cruelest month in Texas because it tricks you into thinking the heat will be gentle, and then by Wednesday it has changed its mind entirely. She came on the noon stage from San Antonio, sitting straight-backed with her hands folded in her lap, and a trunk strapped to the roof that contained everything she owned in the world. She was 27 years old, a widow of 8 months, and she had that particular kind of beauty that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply settles into a room and refuses to leave. Her husband, Thomas Doyle, had been a good man and a poor businessman, which is a combination that produces a great deal of love and very little money. He had died of a fever in San Antonio the previous August, leaving Martha with a small inheritance from his mother, a pile of debts, and the kind of grief that sits so heavy on the chest you forget, for long stretches, that breathing is supposed to feel natural. She had sold what she could, paid what she owed, and with what remained she had purchased the modest house on Maple Street in Harlan Creek, sight unseen, from a land agent who had described it as having excellent bones and a promising garden. He had not been entirely dishonest. The bones were decent. The garden was a patch of dry dirt with 2 stubborn rose bushes that looked like they had survived the war through sheer spite. The house sat at the quiet end of Maple Street, 3 doors from the corner where Maple met Sycamore, and it had a porch that caught the afternoon light in a way that made everything look warmer than it was. Martha had stood on that porch the first evening with her hands on the railing and looked out at the long, flat Texas sky going orange and pink at the edges, and she had made herself a promise. She would not spend the rest of her life looking backward. She would plant things in that dirt. She would learn the names of her neighbors. She would find a way to be useful, and being useful would lead to being content, and being content was, she had decided, a reasonable thing to hope for. She introduced herself around town with the direct and unhurried manner of a woman who has survived enough to know that shyness is a luxury. She visited the mercantile run by a cheerful round man named Gerald Prout, who sold her flour and dried beans, and told her the entire social history of Harlan Creek in the time it took to weigh out her cornmeal. She met the schoolteacher, a Miss Clara Voss, who was young and earnest and starved for educated conversation. She met Reverend Aldridge and his wife Doris, who invited her to Sunday services and pressed a jar of preserved peaches into her hands before she had managed to agree to anything. She met old Pete Sanderson, who sat outside the barber shop every morning in a wooden chair and cataloged the movements of every person who passed, and who told her with great seriousness that the town was generally decent but that she ought to keep her doors locked because of the Creston boys. "They haven't come into town directly," Pete told her, squinting up at her from beneath the brim of a hat that had seen better decades. "But they're out there. Their leader, fellow named Fletcher, he's a ghost. Nobody catches him. Sheriff Holt has been trying for going on 4 years." Martha had thanked Pete politely and gone home and thought about it very briefly, and then turned her attention to the more immediate problem of her rose bushes, which she suspected needed both water and encouragement. She had been in Harlan Creek for 11 days when she first saw Eli Fletcher, and she did not know that is who he was. It was a Saturday morning, and the weekly market had set up along the main street, with wagons selling produce and a woman from the Comanche trade roads offering blankets and beadwork. Martha was examining apples when she became aware that the general mood of the street had shifted in the way moods shift when someone walks into a room who changes the atmosphere without doing anything specific. She looked up. He was standing at the edge of the market, near the water trough, with a horse behind him that was the most beautiful animal Martha had seen in her life. A dark bay with a white blaze, and the kind of calm intelligence in its eyes that good horses always have. The man himself was watching the market with an expression of careful neutrality that struck Martha as the expression of someone who is making a continuous effort not to be noticed, while also being entirely incapable of not being noticed. He wore a dusty coat, a hat pulled low, and there was something about the stillness of him that suggested he could stand that way for hours without discomfort. What she noticed most was that everyone around her noticed him and then deliberately looked away, which is a very specific kind of noticing that involves more awareness than simply staring would. She did not look away. He seemed to feel her eyes on him, because after a moment he turned his head and looked directly at her, and Martha, who had been raised to believe that staring was rude but had never quite managed to internalize that belief, simply kept looking. His gray eyes met hers across the noise and bustle of the Saturday market and held there for a beat that was slightly too long to be accidental. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a small, precise gesture, and turned and led his horse away down the side street. "Best not to stare at that one," said Gerald Prout, who had materialized at her elbow with the timing of a man who spent his days collecting information. "That's Eli Fletcher." Martha looked at Gerald. "The outlaw Pete Sanderson told me about." "The very same." Gerald picked up an apple and examined it. "He comes into town sometimes, bold as you please. Sheriff Holt can't touch him unless he catches him in the act, and Fletcher's too smart for that. He just comes and goes like a regular citizen. Drives Holt half to madness." Gerald put the apple down. "Best to keep your distance, Mrs. Doyle. Man like that has nothing good to offer." Martha thought about the way Eli Fletcher had looked at her. She thought about the particular quality of his stillness and the deliberate politeness of that hat-touching gesture, and the fact that of all the people in that market who had noticed him and looked away, she had been the only one to simply look. "I'm sure you're right," she said pleasantly, and bought her apples and went home. She thought about him for 3 days, which annoyed her. The second time she saw him was not at the market. It was a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks after the market, and Martha had spent the afternoon replanting her rose bushes in better soil that she had mixed herself with composted matter from the kitchen and some sand she'd carried up from the creek bed. She was on her knees in the garden in the blue evening light with dirt on her hands and her sleeves rolled to the elbow when she heard a horse stop on the street in front of her house. She looked up through the picket fence and saw the dark bay horse with the white blaze, standing patient and still. Its rider sat easy in the saddle with the last of the daylight catching the edge of his jaw, and he was looking at her rose bushes with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Those are dog rose," he said, without looking at her. "Needs more water than you think and less fuss than you're giving it." Martha sat back on her heels and looked at him. "You know roses." He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was carefully arranged around an inner amusement he was not quite suppressing. "My mother grew them, back in Missouri." He paused. "Water them at the base, not the leaves. And they want morning sun, not afternoon. You've got them facing west." Martha considered the rose bushes, then looked back at him. "Did you come down Maple Street specifically to give gardening advice, Mr. Fletcher?" He went still at the sound of his name, and something shifted behind his eyes, not alarm exactly, but a recalibration. "You know who I am." "Gerald Prout is very thorough," Martha said. "He told me about you the day I saw you at the market. And you're talking to me anyway." "You're giving me useful information about my roses," Martha said. "It would be rude not to respond." He looked at her for a long moment, and Martha, on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose at one side, looked back at him with the same direct steadiness she brought to everything. She was not afraid of him. She was curious about him, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more difficult to manage. "You're the new widow on Maple Street," he said. It was not a question. "Martha Doyle," she said. "And yes, I'm aware that the whole town knows my business." Small towns are like that. Something that might have been a smile moved across his face, brief and careful, like a bird landing on a branch and immediately thinking better of it. "Yes, they are," he said. He pulled gently on the reins and the bay horse shifted. "Good evening, Mrs. Doyle. Water those roses." He rode away, and Martha stayed on her knees in the dirt and listened to the sound of his horse's hooves diminishing down the street and told herself very firmly that it meant nothing. A man stopping to give gardening advice was not a significant event. The fact that her heart was beating slightly faster than usual was simply the result of the physical exertion of gardening, and the slight warmth in her face was the last of the western sun, which had not yet gone down entirely. She watered the roses at their bases before she went inside. He came back the following Saturday, not at dusk this time, but in the full bright morning, and he did not stop in front of her house. He rode past on the far side of the street, and she was on her porch with her coffee, and she watched him go, and he did not look at her at all. But when he turned the corner at Sycamore, his horse paused for just a fraction of a second before he urged it forward. The Saturday after that, she was inside when she heard a knock at her gate, and she came out to find a small bundle wrapped in cloth sitting on her porch step. Inside the cloth were 3 paper packets of rose seeds, a deep red variety, labeled in an unfamiliar handwriting and nothing else. No note, no name. Clara Voss, the schoolteacher, came to call that afternoon, and Martha showed her the seeds over tea. "Someone left these on my porch," Martha said. "I don't know who." Clara looked at the handwriting on the packets and her eyebrows climbed. "You don't have any idea." "I have an idea," Martha said honestly. "I'm just not certain." Clara set the packets down carefully. "Martha, you should know something about this town. People talk, and people have been talking about the fact that Eli Fletcher has been seen on Maple Street twice in the past 2 weeks. Old Pete Sanderson has been watching from his chair outside the barber shop, and Pete doesn't miss anything. He gives good gardening advice," Martha said. Clara stared at her. "He's an outlaw, Martha. I know that. He robs freight wagons. I know that too. He's been wanted by the sheriff for 4 years. "Clara," Martha said gently, "I have not invited the man to dinner. He stopped to tell me how to water my roses. I'm not planning to run off to the Creston Ravine." Clara pressed her lips together in a way that said she was not fully reassured. "Just be careful," she said. "People in this town have long memories, and a widow's reputation is a fragile thing." Martha thought about that after Clara left. She thought about it seriously, because Clara was right. She was a widow alone in a small town, and a widow's reputation was fragile, and her ability to build the quiet, useful life she had promised herself depended in part on what Harlan Creek thought of her. She was aware of all of this. She planted the red rose seeds the next morning. The third proper conversation she had with Eli Fletcher happened by chance, if anything between them could really be called chance. It was a Wednesday in May, warm now in the way May in Texas actually means it, and Martha was walking home from the general store with her basket when her path took her down the alley beside the feed store, because the main street was blocked by a wagon with a broken wheel, creating considerable chaos. She came around the corner and very nearly walked directly into Eli Fletcher, who was standing with his back against the feed store wall, eating an apple with the unhurried patience of a man who has nowhere specific to be. They both stopped. They looked at each other, and then Martha, because she was who she was, said, "The roses are coming up nicely, actually." He had swallowed a bite of apple. "The red ones or the older ones?" "Both, though the older ones are still more hopeful than producing." She shifted her basket. "You should have left a note." "I wasn't sure they'd be welcome," he said. "They were very welcome," she said, "but you should have left a note." He turned the apple in his hand and looked at it. He had a quality of stillness in close proximity that was different from the stillness she had noticed from a distance. It was not the stillness of a man suppressing himself, but the stillness of a man who is genuinely, fully present in a moment, paying attention to it with everything he has. It was, Martha thought, a rare quality. Thomas had been like that in his better moments. "Your husband," he said, without looking up from the apple. What was he like? The question surprised her. Most people did not ask that. Most people offered condolences and then carefully avoided the subject of Thomas, as though naming him too clearly might break her. "He was kind," she said. "Funny when he let himself be. Bad with money but wonderful with people. He believed the best of everyone, which was sometimes a problem and always an asset." She paused. "Why do you ask? You don't seem like a woman who married a bad man," he said, "and you seem like the kind of woman who would." That surprised her too, and also made her laugh, which surprised her most of all because she had not laughed unexpectedly in a long time. That is an extremely odd thing to say. The edge of his mouth moved. "It came out wrong. I meant, you seem like you choose with intention. You looked at me at the market and you didn't look away, and most people look away from me. That takes a certain kind of deliberateness. I figured you married deliberately too." The honesty of this landed somewhere in the center of Martha's chest with a quiet weight. "Thomas was my deliberate choice," she said. "He was also a good one, even if we didn't get enough time." Eli Fletcher looked at her then directly, and his gray eyes were entirely serious. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said. "Thank you," Martha said. And she meant it, because he said it simply, without performance, and it did not feel like a social grace, but like an actual thing he felt. She went home with her basket and her groceries and told herself very firmly, for the fourth or fifth time, that this was nothing. He was an outlaw. She was trying to build a quiet life. These two things were incompatible in every practical and moral sense she could identify. She thought about the quality of his stillness for the rest of the evening. Sheriff Amos Holt was a practical man of 53 who had been doing this job for 15 years and had learned to read a town the way some people read weather. He noticed things before they became obvious to others, and he prided himself on this. So when he started noticing that Eli Fletcher's periodic appearances in Harlan Creek were becoming both more frequent and increasingly centered on the south end of Maple Street, he paid attention. He visited Martha Doyle on a Thursday morning in mid-May, hat in hand at her front door, and she invited him in for coffee with the same direct courtesy she extended to everyone. "I'll get to the point," Holt said, setting his coffee cup down with care. "Eli Fletcher, you've spoken to him." "A few times," Martha said, briefly. Holt looked at her steadily. He was a square-faced man with a thick gray mustache and eyes that had seen enough to be suspicious of pleasant explanations. "Mrs. Doyle, I don't know what you know about Fletcher, so let me fill in the picture. He's wanted in connection with 9 freight robberies, 1 mail coach incident, and a bank in Presidio County. I can't put him in a cell until I catch him in the act, but he's not an innocent man." "I know that," Martha said. "I'm not saying he's the worst of what's out there," Holt continued. "I'll give him that. Nobody's been hurt in any of his jobs. But nobody stays lucky forever, Mrs. Doyle, and the men he rides with are harder than he is in ways that matter. If this keeps on, he stopped himself, choosing words. If you were to become associated with him in the town's mind, it could cause problems for you. Martha looked at her coffee cup. Sheriff, with respect, I am not associated with Eli Fletcher. He has spoken to me on the street and once in an alley. I appreciate your concern and I take it seriously. She looked up. If I had any useful information about his whereabouts or his operations, I would tell you. Holt nodded slowly. I know you would. You strike me as a sensible woman. He picked up his hat. Just be careful, Mrs. Doyle. Men like Fletcher have a way of making people see them differently than they are. After he left, Martha sat for a while in the quiet of her kitchen. She thought about what the sheriff had said, and she thought about Eli Fletcher standing in the alley eating an apple and saying, "I'm sorry about your husband," like he actually meant it. She thought about Thomas, and about the way grief makes you both harder and more open than you were before, harder to surface things, more open to the underneath of things. She thought about the fact that she knew, with the same deliberateness Eli had attributed to her, that she was in danger of feeling something she had not expected to feel again. And she thought about the fact that what she felt was not reckless or foolish or the desperate loneliness of a widow reaching for warmth. It was specific. It was about him, and that made it considerably more complicated. The Creston boys came into Harlan Creek on a Friday evening at the end of May, and this was not something that happened often. They were 4 men, Creston regulars named Dale Hicks, Reeve Saunders, Cobb Whatley, and a newer man called Boyd, whose last name nobody seemed to know, and they hit the saloon hard, and by 9 o'clock they were loud and unreasonable, and Dale Hicks had broken a chair over the card table in a dispute about the deal. Eli was not with them. This was something people noticed and noted. Deputy Cal Morrison, a young man of 24 who was brave in the impulsive way of people who haven't yet met consequences, went into the saloon to manage the situation and was pushed sideways into the bar by Cobb Whatley, which resulted in a split lip and a considerable blow to his dignity. Morrison went for his gun and Reeve Saunders caught his wrist, and the whole thing was about 45 seconds from becoming something irreversible when the saloon doors opened and Eli Fletcher walked in. Martha was not there to see this. She heard about it afterward from Gerald Prout, who heard it from the bartender, who was a man named Joe Cass who had excellent recall and a gift for narrative. Story, as it circulated through Harlan Creek over the following 2 days, was consistent in its essential elements. Eli had walked in, looked at the scene, the deputy's wrist in Saunders' grip, Dale Hicks still holding part of the broken chair, Boyd watching from the corner, and had said, in a voice that was apparently entirely calm and entirely final, "Let him go." Saunders had let go of Morrison's wrist. Eli had then looked at each of his men in turn and said, "You're done here. Get your horses." There had been a moment of the particular tension that happens when a group of armed men decide whether to comply or contest, and then, one by one, they had filed out of the saloon, Saunders last, with a look at Eli that had expressed considerable resentment and very little surprise. Eli had looked at Deputy Morrison, at the split lip and the humiliated expression, and had said, "I'm sorry for that," and then he had left too. Morrison had told Sheriff Holt what happened, and Holt had stood very still for a moment, and then said something thoughtful in a low voice that Morrison didn't quite catch. The story as it moved through the town in the days following accumulated embellishments and interpretive variations, as stories do. But one element that everyone agreed on was what old Pete Sanderson said from his chair outside the barber shop, with the authority of a man who believes deeply in his own observations. Fletcher's been coming and going on Maple Street all month, and now he's pulling his men off a fight. You tell me that isn't connected to the widow on Maple Street. You tell me that, and I'll tell you you're not paying attention. Nobody told Pete that. Most people privately agreed with him. Martha heard the story from Clara Voss, who delivered it with a mixture of concern and fascination that she was trying to present as purely concern. Martha listened to the whole of it without interruption, then was quiet for a moment and then said, "He's not a bad man." Clara stared at her. "Martha, I know what he is," Martha said. "I know what he does and I know it's wrong. I'm not defending it. I'm saying that he's not a bad man in the way that bad men are bad. There's a difference." She paused. "I'm not sure what to do with that difference, but I know it's there." Clara sat back. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Martha said honestly. She did not see Eli for 2 weeks after that, and the absence was something she felt in a way she recognized and was not pleased about. She planted the rest of her seeds. She visited Clara at the schoolhouse and helped organize the end-of-year materials. She had dinner twice with Reverend Aldridge and his wife Doris, who were warm and uncomplicated, and asked nothing of her except that she eat enough and be well. She was useful, and she was present, and she was building the life she had promised herself. And at no point during any of it did she stop thinking about Eli Fletcher, which she found both irritating and honest. He came on a Thursday evening in early June, and this time he came to the door. She heard the knock and opened it and found him standing on her porch in the warm summer evening, and he had cleaned up. The coat was brushed. The hat was held in his hands instead of on his head, and he looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way none of his previous expressions had been. "I heard about what happened at the saloon," she said, because she had learned that directness was the language between them. "I figured you had," he said. "Come in," she said. He looked slightly surprised, then stepped inside. Her house was small and comfortable and smelled of bread, and the roses that had begun to bloom in a glass jar on the windowsill. He stood in her sitting room with his hat in his hands and looked at the roses in the jar, and then at the braided rug and the small shelves of books, and the lamp casting its warm circle of light, and he looked like a man who had not stood in a place like this in a very long time. She put the kettle on. He sat in the chair she indicated carefully, as though he was aware of himself in the space and did not want to take up more of it than was offered. "Tell me something true," Martha said from the kitchen doorway. "Why do you do it? The robberies, the Creston boys. You're not stupid. You're not cruel, so why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It started as necessity," he said. "I came out of Missouri after my mother died, no work, no money, no connections in this part of the world. First job I did with Hicks was a freight wagon out of El Paso, and we got $50 apiece and nobody got hurt. That was more money than I'd seen in 6 months of honest work." He turned his hat in his hands. "And then it kept going, and I kept telling myself it was temporary, just until I had enough to start clean somewhere else. But enough kept moving." He looked up at her. "That's how it works. You start thinking about enough, and enough turns into a horizon that never comes closer." Martha came back with the coffee. She had decided coffee was better for this conversation than tea, and set his cup on the small table beside him and sat down across from him with her own. "The horizon," she said. "Yes." "What would you do?" she asked. "If you stopped, if you started clean, what would you actually do?" He looked at the question as though he was picking it up and turning it over. "I used to think about land," he said. "A small place, enough for a garden, a few cattle, something that grew instead of something that took." He said the last part with a quietness that carried a weight she recognized, because she had said things to herself in those months after Thomas died that also carried that kind of weight, the weight of knowing something about yourself that you aren't entirely proud of. "You could still do that," she said. "A man with a wanted poster can't walk into a land office," he said. "No," she said. "Not until he deals with the wanted poster." The word hung in the warm air of the sitting room. Eli looked at her, and Martha looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. "Martha," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and the way he said it was very careful and very direct, and told her something she had already suspected. "I'm not here to make your life complicated. I know what you're building, and I know what I am, and I know those things don't, Eli," she said, and he stopped. "I'm a woman who has buried a husband and sold her furniture and crossed half a state with a trunk and 2 rose bushes and replanted them in better dirt. I decide what my life is, not the town and not you." She paused. But what I decide has to be based on who you actually are, not who you've been, who you are." He was very still. The lamp between them put gold in his gray eyes and drew shadows along the line of his jaw, and Martha thought, with the same deliberateness she brought to everything, that she was in serious trouble and that it was the best kind. "I don't know how to answer that yet," he said finally. "I know," she said. "Take some time." He left an hour later, and she watched from her porch as he rode the bay horse, whose name, she had learned during that hour, was cannon down Maple Street toward Sycamore, and she went inside and sat by the lamp for a while thinking about things growing instead of taking, and about horizons that move. The crisis came in the second week of June, and it came because Reeve Saunders had no patience and a great deal of resentment, and had decided, on his own authority, to hit the Harlan Creek bank. Martha heard the shots from her garden. They were not many, 4, maybe 5, and they came from the direction of Main Street, and they had the flat, purposeful quality of shots fired with intent rather than the irregular pop of someone celebrating. She went inside immediately and latched her shutters, which was the sensible thing to do, and then she stood in her kitchen and listened. It was over in less than 20 minutes. Later, the account that Sheriff Holt and Deputy Morrison assembled went like this. Saunders, Hicks, and Boyd had entered the Harlan Creek Cattlemen's Bank at just past 2 in the afternoon with masks and guns. They had taken money from the teller and were preparing to clean out the safe when the thing that Saunders had not accounted for occurred. Eli Fletcher walked through the bank's front door. He was not masked. He was not armed, or rather he wore his guns, but he did not draw them. He walked through the door and he looked at Saunders and he said, loud enough for the teller and the 2 customers on the floor to hear clearly, "This is done. Nobody is leaving here like this." Saunders, who had considerably less self-control than Eli had always managed to impose on situations, pointed his gun at Eli and said something that the witnesses reported as violent and unprintable. The teller, who had a shotgun under the counter that he had apparently forgotten until that moment, brought it up. Boyd, who was not a man of strong convictions, went out the back door and was gone. The teller with his shotgun and Eli with his voice managed to talk Saunders and Hicks down from the edge of something catastrophic, and by the time Sheriff Holt arrived, both men were sitting on the bank floor with their hands up, and Eli Fletcher was standing against the far wall with his hands visible and an expression that, Holt said later, looked like a man who had made a decision and was watching it become real. Holt arrested Saunders and Hicks. Then he looked at Eli, who had not moved from the wall. Eli said, "I'd like to turn myself in, Sheriff, for the freight jobs, the mail coach, the Presidio Bank." He reached down and unbuckled his holster and held it out. All of it. Holt took the holster. He looked at Eli for a long time. Then he said, "All right, Fletcher," and that was that. The news went through Harlan Creek like water through dry ground, fast and deep, and reaching every corner simultaneously. By evening, every person in town knew what had happened, and Pete Sanderson, who had not been anywhere near Main Street but had gathered the intelligence from 3 separate sources within the hour, settled it in everyone's mind with 6 words delivered from his chair outside the barber shop. "Told you. It's the widow on Maple Street." Martha heard it from Clara, who came to the door red-faced and breathless at 4:30. "Martha," he turned himself in. Eli Fletcher walked into the bank and stopped Saunders and Hicks, and then he turned himself in to the sheriff. Martha sat down. "The whole town is talking," Clara said, sitting across from her and taking her hands. "Martha, everyone knows, Pete's been saying it for weeks, that Fletcher was spending time on Maple Street, and now," she stopped. "Martha, are you all right?" Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is he hurt?" "No, he's in the jail. Nobody's hurt, actually, not seriously." Clara squeezed her hands. "Martha, what did you say to him?" "I told him who you are has to be based on what you do," Martha said. "Not what you've done." She stood up. "I need to speak to Sheriff Holt." Clara stood too. "Martha, I don't think—" "I know what you think," Martha said, already getting her shawl. "You think it will look a certain way, and maybe it will, but he's in that jail because of a decision he made, and I'm going to acknowledge that because he deserves to have someone acknowledge it." She walked to the sheriff's office with her back straight and her chin level, and if people watched from porches and windows as she went. And they did, because Pete Sanderson had already established the narrative and people were confirming it with their own eyes. She did not alter her pace or her posture for any of them. Holt received her with a gravity that was also, she thought, a kind of respect. He took her into the office and they sat across the desk from each other, and she said, "I want you to know that I did not ask him to do this. Whatever the town thinks about what's been happening on Maple Street, I didn't ask him." "I know that," Holt said. "Nobody suggested otherwise, not to me." He leaned back in his chair. "He asked about you, actually, after I brought him in." He said, Holt paused, selecting his words. "He said he wanted to make sure you weren't disturbed by any of this." Martha looked at her hands in her lap. "He's going to face a judge, Mrs. Doyle," Holt said. "He's turned himself involuntarily and he stopped the bank job, and nobody's been hurt in any of his prior jobs. Judge Carraway rides this circuit in August. Between now and then, Fletcher stays in my jail." He paused. "The voluntary surrender will count. Stopping a crime in progress will count. It's not nothing. But I want to be honest with you, he could still face significant time." "Can I see him?" Martha asked. Holt looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he nodded once and stood up. The jail was at the back of the building, 3 cells in a row, and Eli was in the middle one, sitting on the narrow cot with his forearms on his knees and his head up. He looked at her when she came in, and his face did something careful and complicated. She stopped outside the bars and they looked at each other. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know I didn't have to," she said. "The whole town is going to talk. They've been talking about me since I arrived," she said. "I find I don't mind as much as I might." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" "Fine." A pause. "Better than I expected to feel." She understood that. She understood the way a thing you've been carrying for a long time becomes lighter when you set it down, even if setting it down costs you something. "Eli, I want you to know something," she said. "What you did today, stopping Saunders, turning yourself in, that's the bravest thing I've seen anyone do, because it wasn't brave in the way that's easy. It was brave in the way that costs you." He looked at the floor of the cell. "I've been thinking about what you said, about who you are having to be based on what you do." He looked up. "I had to do something that made sense when I measured it that way." "And you thought of me," she said. "I thought of you," he said. "That's the truth of it." The silence between them was the warm kind, the kind with weight and substance. Martha put her hand on the bar of the cell door, not reaching through but simply resting it there, and Eli looked at her hand and then at her face. "I'm going to be here until August," he said, "when the judge comes. I know. That's a long time for someone to wait around." "I'm not going anywhere," Martha said. "I have roses to tend to." Something happened in his face then that was not quite a smile, but was the architecture of one something that rearranged his features in a way that was both unfamiliar and entirely right. "They came up," he said. "The red ones. They came up beautifully," she said. She visited every few days, bringing coffee and books and news of the town, and sometimes they talked for an hour, and sometimes they sat in a comfortable quiet that needed nothing to fill it. She told him about Thomas, the real stories. The time Thomas had invested their rent money in a scheme to sell quality ink to the printing offices in San Antonio, and come home with 60 jars of blue-black ink that turned out to be only moderately quality, and the story of their frantic 2 days selling ink at a loss before the landlord came for the rent. Thomas would have told it on himself with enormous delight, and Martha found that telling it to Eli had the same quality of delight. He laughed at the ink story, genuinely, openly, and the laugh surprised him. You could see that, as though laughter from a certain depth was not something he was entirely familiar with. He told her about Missouri, about his mother, who had been a small, fierce woman who grew things everywhere she could find dirt, and who had died of a winter cold that turned to pneumonia when Eli was 24, and whose absence had been the first real unmooring of his life. He told her about the months after, drifting west, finding work where he could find it and not finding it where he couldn't, and meeting Dale Hicks at a card game in El Paso, and making the first bad decision in what had become a pattern of them. "When did you start wanting something different?" Martha asked, on a Wednesday afternoon in early July, with the heat sitting thick outside and the jail surprisingly cool in the shade of the building's northern wall. He thought about it with the same care he brought to everything she asked. "I think the wanting was always there," he said. "I just stopped paying attention to it. It's easier not to want things that seem impossible." He looked at his hands. "When you're doing what I was doing, you don't think about the future much. Future starts to feel like a luxury you don't get to have." "And now," she said, he looked at her through the bars and his gray eyes were very direct. "Now I think about it all the time," he said. "What comes after? What's possible?" He paused. "What I might deserve to have if I did the right things going forward. What do you think you might deserve?" She asked, keeping her voice neutral even though her heart was doing something that was not neutral at all. "I'd like to find out," he said, "if you'd let me." Martha looked at him. She looked at the bars between them, and the dust in the summer light, and his hands resting on his knees, and his eyes that were entirely serious. She thought about Thomas, who was in the ground in San Antonio, and who had been her deliberate choice and her good love, and whose absence was a hole in her life that would never fully close. She thought about how love doesn't replace things. It builds alongside them and the hole remains, and the new thing is its own thing, real and separate and not in competition with what came before. "I'd let you," she said. The summer moved forward with the slow weight of Texas heat, and Martha continued to visit, and the town continued to watch and discuss. And at some point, the watching shifted from disapproval to something that was not quite rooting for them, but was in the territory adjacent to it. Gerald Prout, who was the town's primary social barometer, started referring to Eli as "that Fletcher fellow who's sitting in Holt's jail," in a tone that was almost neutral. Reverend Aldridge prayed publicly for all those seeking to make themselves right with the Lord and the law, which was clearly about Eli, and the town received this as endorsement. Doris Aldridge, who was the more practical of the two, came to visit Martha and said simply, "How is he?" The Creston boys had scattered. Saunders and Hicks were in a county jail further south waiting for their own judge. Boyd had vanished. Cobb Whatley, who had not been at the bank and whose name had come up in various accounts of the freight robberies, was picked up in another county a week after Eli's surrender. The Creston boys, as an operating outfit, were finished. Sheriff Holt visited Eli regularly, and their conversations, which had begun with the wariness of adversaries, had become something more measured and honest. Holt told Martha one afternoon that Eli had provided information voluntarily, without being asked, about the locations and methods of 3 freight robbery jobs that had helped resolve outstanding claims. "He's not making this easy for himself," Holt told her. "Some men would lawyer up, say nothing, make the prosecution work for every charge. He's walking into all of it." He paused. "I've been in this job a long time, Mrs. Doyle. That matters." Judge Archibald Caraway arrived on the 3rd Thursday of August, dusty from the circuit road, and carrying a heavy leather satchel that contained the accumulated moral weight of 7 counties. He was 60 years old, thin as a fence rail, and had the particular quality of fairness that comes not from sympathy, but from a complete refusal to be impressed by anything other than evidence and precedent. He heard Eli Fletcher's case on a Friday morning, in the small courtroom that doubled as a town meeting hall. Martha sat in the 3rd row, hands folded in her lap, and she watched the judge's face and Eli's face, and tried to read both of them without projection. Eli stood and spoke for himself with a directness that was entirely in character. He said what he had done, said why, said that he understood why the law held him to account for it. He said he had stopped the bank robbery voluntarily, turned himself in voluntarily, and had cooperated fully with the sheriff's investigation. He said he intended to live a different kind of life if the court saw fit to give him the chance. Judge Caraway asked questions. He was thorough and he was quick, and he had clearly read everything Holt had submitted with some care. He questioned Holt. He questioned Deputy Morrison, who was honest and fair in his account of the saloon incident and the bank. He questioned the bank teller, who said that Fletcher had walked in unarmed in attitude if not in fact, and had managed a situation that had all the qualities of a catastrophe, and had kept it from being one. The judge deliberated for 1 hour. Martha sat in the courtroom during that hour and did not move. Caraway returned, sat, arranged his papers, and looked at Eli Fletcher with the expression of a man who has weighed things carefully and arrived at a place he is prepared to defend. "The law has an obligation to take seriously what you've done," Caraway said. 9 freight robberies, 1 mail coach incident, and an accessory charge on the Presidio Bank. These are not trivial matters. Property was taken from people who earned it, and the fact that violence did not accompany your crimes is to your credit but does not erase the crimes themselves. He paused. However, the law also has an obligation to recognize voluntary surrender, full cooperation, and the demonstrated willingness to stop, actively stop, a situation that had the potential for serious harm. Another pause. "I'm sentencing you to 3 years, with the first year served and the remaining 2 suspended, contingent on conduct, restitution of the assessed amounts, and regular reporting to Sheriff Holt for a period of 2 years following release." Martha breathed. Time served. Eli had been in the jail for just over 2.5 months, which was applied, and the assessed restitution was a significant sum, but not an impossible one. Caraway had done the math that a fair judge does, which is the math of what the world gains versus what it loses. Eli had turned to look at her before they led him back to the cell to process the paperwork, and the look he gave her said everything and asked nothing. Martha nodded once, a small, precise movement, and he held her eyes for 2 seconds and then turned away. The 1 year of actual confinement moved differently from the summer months. Martha settled into the rhythm of her life in Harlan Creek with intention and purpose. She found work teaching reading at the schoolhouse 2 afternoons a week, which Clara was grateful for, and which Martha found deeply satisfying in the particular way that useful work is satisfying. She expanded her garden, planting vegetables alongside the roses, and learned from Doris Aldridge the specific methods of canning and preserving that made a Texas summer's abundance last through winter. She became part of the town in the way she had hoped to become, not central or loud about it, but woven in, reliable, known. She visited Eli every week without exception. They read books together, passing them through the bars and discussing them with the seriousness of people who take books seriously. She brought him news of the town and news of the garden, and he asked questions that showed he was paying attention to both. He had a quiet humor that revealed itself in increments, dry and precise, that made her laugh in the unexpected way she had come to love. She told him once that laughing unexpectedly was one of the things she had missed most in the months after Thomas, and he had looked at her with an expression of such serious attention that she had to look away for a moment. He asked her on an October evening when the first real cool of autumn had finally arrived and the light through the jail window was the color of honey if she would consider writing to him. "I mean after," he said, "if they move me to the county facility, writing letters." "I'll write to you every week," she said. "You don't have to, Eli," she said. "You know me well enough by now to know that when I say I'll do something, I mean it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to have some money eventually." "Not from the robberies. That's all going to restitution. But I've been thinking, and there's a man named Corrigan in the valley south of here who runs a small ranch operation and has been looking for a good hand with horses. Holt mentioned it. I know horses." He paused. "It's not the land I was imagining. It's starting smaller, but it's a start." "A start is exactly what it is," Martha said. "By the time I'm out," he said carefully, "and working and have something to offer," he stopped himself, looking at his hands. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "Don't wait until you have something to offer," she said. "That's another version of the horizon that keeps moving. I know what you're trying to say, and I'm saying you don't have to have it all arranged first." He held her eyes for a long moment. "Martha, you are the most direct woman I have ever encountered." "I know," she said. "It saves a great deal of time." They transferred him to the county facility in November, and the letters began. She wrote to him every Sunday evening at the table by the lamp, and his letters came back every 2 weeks, then every week, and they were long and careful and full of the same quality of attention she had come to associate entirely with him. He described the facility and the work they were given, and the other men there with the unsentimental precision of someone who sees clearly and reports honestly. She described the town and the schoolhouse and the progress of the garden and occasionally Clara, who had become her closest friend, and who was conducting a careful and sweetly awkward courtship with a young farmer named Henry Rowan that Martha found both endearing and exciting to observe. She described the first snowfall, which Harlan Creek got rarely and briefly in December, and which put her in the garden the next morning to look at the white covering her roses before it melted. She described things she had not described to many people, the particular quality of Sunday mornings when the silence in the house was very quiet and she became most aware of Thomas's absence. She wrote about grief honestly because she could with him. She wrote, "The grief doesn't get smaller. I think it's more accurate to say that I get bigger around it, and the proportion changes, and that is what people mean when they say it gets easier. I wanted you to know that because I think you should understand what you would be choosing if you were choosing me. You would be choosing someone who has loved someone else, and who carries that, and who is also fully present and fully here. Those two things coexist, and I think you should know it." He wrote back, "I have been reading your letter about grief for 3 days. I think you have described something that most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid knowing, which is that love isn't a zero-sum thing. It doesn't cancel what came before. I've been carrying the evidence of my own bad decisions for years, and what you've described is the healthier version of that, which is carrying the evidence of good love without letting it stop you from more. I want more. I want it with the same deliberateness you use for everything, and I think you know that." Martha read that letter twice, and then folded it with the other she kept in a wooden box on the shelf next to the books. The year passed. In March, there was a crisis with the schoolhouse. The roof had developed a significant leak, and the school board was debating repair costs with the painful slowness of committees everywhere. And Martha organized the women of Maple Street into a fundraising effort that produced, within 2 weeks, enough money to fix the roof and replace 3 window panes as well. Clara was near tears with gratitude. Gerald Prout said it was the most efficiently organized effort he had ever witnessed, which was his highest form of praise. Reverend Aldridge preached a sermon on community that referenced it without naming names, which was the Reverend's characteristic method. In May, a letter came from a man named Corrigan. He had heard through Holt, apparently about Eli's situation and his skill with horses, and he was willing to hold a position for Eli when he was released. It was fair wages, a small cabin on the property, and honest work. Martha read the letter, which Eli had forwarded to her with a note in the margin that said, "Tell me what you think," and she wrote back immediately, "I think it is a beginning, and beginnings are good." The fall of 1884 brought the end of Eli's year of confinement, and the day he walked out of the county facility in the last week of October was a cool, clean-aired morning, and he had $11 in his pocket and a letter from Martha in the inside breast pocket of the coat he'd kept. He rode to Harlan Creek on a horse he had arranged to borrow from a man at the facility who owed him a favor, and he came down the main street of Harlan Creek in the early afternoon. People saw him. People looked. It was not the way they had looked before, not the looking away of those who are cautious around something dangerous, but the looking at of people who are curious about what happens next. Pete Sanderson, who had stationed himself at his usual post outside the barber shop, watched him ride past with the satisfaction of a man whose predictions have proved correct. Eli stopped at the sheriff's office first, because Caraway's sentence required him to report to Holt. He went in and stood in the office where he had laid his guns on the desk the previous summer, and Holt stood up and looked at him, and then extended his hand. Eli took it. "Corrigan's expecting you Monday," Holt said. "But that's 3 days off. Where are you staying?" "I'll figure it out," Eli said. Holt looked at him steadily. "You could go say hello to Mrs. Doyle first," he said. "She's probably at the schoolhouse until 3. Eli went to the schoolhouse. He stood outside the window and looked in, and she was at the front of the room with a group of 8 children ranging in age from 6 to 12. And she was teaching them to read from a primer. And she was doing it with the full, generous attention she brought to everything, crouching to a small boy's level to point at the word on his page, and asking him something that made him frown in concentration, and then look up with sudden brightness when he got it. She had a way of receiving other people's small victories that made them feel like large ones, and watching it through the window, Eli felt the thing in his chest that had been building for a year and a half settle into something that had weight and certainty. He waited outside until the school day ended, and the children came filing out into the afternoon. Martha came last, pulling the door closed behind her, and she had her shawl and her bag and her eyes were down on the latch until she turned. She looked up and saw him. For a moment neither of them moved. The afternoon light was the long gold of an October afternoon in Texas, and the main street was busy behind him with the ordinary sounds of a working day, and she stood on the schoolhouse steps, and he stood on the ground below them, and they looked at each other. "You're out," she said. "I'm out," he said. She came down the steps and stopped in front of him, close, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him at that first market, directly, without looking away. He looked back at her with everything he'd been thinking for a year in his eyes. "Eli," she said. "Martha," he said. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Better than I've ever been," he said. She reached out and touched his face, just briefly with her hand, the way you touch something you want to be sure is real. He caught her hand in both of his and held it there, warm and careful, and she felt the calluses on his palms and the steadiness of his grip and thought, with the clean clarity of something being simply and finally known. There it is. They had dinner that evening at the Aldridges, because Doris had insisted, had, in fact, sent a note to the school earlier in the week saying that when Eli Fletcher arrived in Harlan Creek, he was to be brought to dinner, and that was not a request but a fact. The Aldridge house was warm and smelled of roasted chicken, and there was wine that had come from somewhere generous, and Reverend Aldridge said grace that was long and earnest, and included something about second chances that made Eli look at the tablecloth for a moment. Over dinner, Eli talked about Corrigan's ranch and his plans, and Aldridge asked thoughtful questions, and Doris kept putting more food on his plate without asking, which is the highest form of welcome. Martha sat across from him and caught his eye once, and they shared a look that contained an entire private conversation. He slept at the boarding house on Main Street, and he started at Corrigan's ranch on Monday morning, and it was exactly what it appeared to be: hard, honest work with horses on a small, well-run operation south of town. Corrigan was a quiet, practical man in his 50s who did not comment on Eli's history and did not avoid it, simply working alongside him and making assessments based on what he saw, which was a man who was very good with horses, precise, patient, and entirely reliable. Over the months that followed, Eli built his new life with the same deliberateness Martha had attributed to him. He worked, he paid his restitution in monthly amounts that Holt tracked and verified. He reported to the sheriff faithfully and without resentment. He came into town most Saturdays, and he walked Martha home from the market or the schoolhouse, and people watched them, and the watching became ordinary, which is the best kind of acceptance. He courted her with the same careful precision he brought to everything, not extravagantly, but genuinely. He brought her things from the ranch, information about horses and land that she found interesting. He brought her books he had read and wanted to discuss. He brought her wildflowers once, which surprised him more than her, and he stood on her porch with a handful of them looking slightly uncertain about having done it, and she took them with a smile that she knew was probably too large and didn't care. He kissed her for the first time on a February evening in 1885, standing on her porch with the winter stars enormous above the Texas flats. And it was not dramatic in the way of things that have been building and finally break, but deeply quiet and certain, which was entirely right for both of them. She kissed him back with her hand on the lapel of his coat and felt his hands at her waist, careful and present, and thought about beginnings. He proposed on a Saturday morning in the spring, not on one knee with great ceremony. That was not his way and she would not have wanted it, but across her kitchen table over coffee, with his eyes entirely serious and his voice very steady. "Martha," he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked up. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I have a cabin on Corrigan's property and a modest amount of savings and a reasonable horse and a great deal of intention for the future. I'm aware that's not a fortune. I'm also aware that you don't need a fortune. But I want to be the man who comes home to your kitchen and argues with you about books and watches your roses come up every spring for the rest of my life, if you'll have me." Martha set down her coffee cup with perfect composure. Her heart was doing something very undignified that she kept entirely off her face. She looked at him across the table and thought about Thomas, and thought about grief, and thought about being bigger around the hole instead of the hole being smaller, and she thought about red rose seeds wrapped in cloth left on a porch step. "I'll have you," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and squeezed it once, and they sat like that for a moment in the morning light. They were married in Reverend Aldridge's church on a Saturday in June of 1885, with the whole of Harlan Creek invited, which was Doris Aldridge's doing, and which Martha accepted with the gracious practicality of a woman who understands that communities need things to celebrate. Clara Voss stood up with her, wearing the nice dress she had acquired for her own wedding to Henry Rowan the previous December. Gerald Prout gave a toast at the reception in the churchyard that was simultaneously effusive and precisely accurate, which was his particular gift. Pete Sanderson attended and shook Eli's hand and said, without irony, "I knew it before anyone," which was completely true. Sheriff Holt attended and stood in the back and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man who is satisfied with an outcome he had helped bring about through a combination of patience and honest dealing. At the end of the evening he shook Eli's hand and said, "Don't give me cause to regret this, Fletcher." And Eli said, "I won't, sir." And both of them knew it was true. Eli's restitution was completed in full by September of 1885 ahead of schedule, because he was that kind of man. Holt signed off on the completion report to Judge Carraway's office with a note that said Fletcher had fulfilled every condition of his sentence, and that the county had no further interest in the matter. Eli Fletcher had a clean record and a new name in the town's regard, not the outlaw, not the Creston man, but Martha Doyle's husband, which was the identity he wore most comfortably. They lived in Eli's cabin on the Corrigan property through the first year of marriage, which was small but warm and had enough land around it for a proper garden. Martha expanded her roses to the full front fence line and added a vegetable plot at the back that was the envy of the other ranch wives. She continued her 2 afternoons at the schoolhouse until December, when she left to manage the increasingly present evidence that their family was growing. Their son was born in July of 1886, in the heat of a Texas summer, healthy and loud, and absolutely convinced of his own importance from the first hour. They named him Thomas Elias Fletcher Thomas for Martha's first husband, which was both deliberate and entirely characteristic of her, and Elias because it was Eli's full name and she had always thought it was a good one. They called him Tommy, and he had his father's gray eyes and his mother's unswerving directness, and the combination was already at 8 months formidable. Corrigan, who had watched the whole of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who made a good hiring decision, offered Eli a partnership stake in the ranch operation in the spring of 1887, which was a significant step, and which they discussed for 2 evenings at the kitchen table before Eli accepted. The Corrigan Ranch grew into a proper operation over the following years, specializing in quality quarter horses that found buyers across 3 counties, and Eli's reputation with horses, the patience, the precision, the deep knowledge he had built since boyhood in Missouri became something the ranch was known for. They bought a small house on the edge of town in 1888, close enough to ride to the ranch daily, but with a larger garden and a proper porch, and 3 bedrooms that Martha furnished with the careful eye of someone who has thought a great deal about what a home should feel like. She moved her rose bushes from every place they had previously lived, the original ones from the Maple Street house, which she had transplanted twice already, and all the subsequent ones, including the deep red varieties from those first paper packets. By the time the house garden was established, it was remarkable roses along every fence, vegetables in generous rows, a kitchen herb patch, and a small apple tree that Clara said would take years, and that Martha said she had years. Clara and Henry Rowan had 3 children by then, and the Rowan farm and the Fletcher ranch house had the comfortable proximity of families who are genuinely close. Sunday dinners rotated between the houses, and the children played in the sort of chaotic, uncomplicated way that children with plenty of space and reasonable supervision always do. Their second child, a daughter born in 1889, they named Rose, which was perhaps too obvious but also entirely right, because she was born in June when the roses along the fence were at their fullest, and the smell came through the windows, and Martha, in the particular clarity of new motherhood, looked at the baby in her arms and thought of seeds in paper packets and dry dirt and stubborn things that grow. Rose had her mother's dark hair and, apparently, her mother's opinions, which she made known from infancy. Eli, who had come from a life of motion and uncertainty, had discovered that stillness of a different kind than the defensive stillness people had noticed in him during his outlaw years. This was the stillness of a man fully located in his life, the stillness of someone who has arrived and knows it. He would sit on the porch in the evenings with Tommy in the yard and Rose asleep on his chest and Martha in the chair beside him reading, and the Texas sky would go its enormous colorful sunset way, and he would feel the weight of his daughter on his chest and the presence of his wife and the sounds of the farm evening, and he would think about the horizon he had once described to Martha, the one that kept moving, the one that meant enough was never enough. This horizon had stopped moving. He was in it. This was it. He told her that once, sitting on the porch in the fall of 1889 with the harvest evening cooling the air, and the children inside with Clara's eldest who had come to watch them so the adults could have an hour. He told her about the moving horizon and the way it had stopped. Martha looked at him sideways with the expression he knew completely by now, the one that was pleased and slightly amused and deeply serious all at once. "You know what I did when I got here," she said. "When I arrived on that stage from San Antonio with my trunk and my grief and those 2 terrible rose bushes." "What?" he said. "I stood on the porch of that house on Maple Street and I made myself a promise," she said. "I said I would plant things and learn names and be useful. That was the whole promise. It was very modest." She looked at the garden. "I did not think this is what it would turn into." "What did you think?" he said. "I thought I would find contentment," she said, "which is what I was aiming for because love seemed like something I'd had and finished." She looked at him. "I was wrong about that." "You are very rarely wrong," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it's worth noting when it happens." He laughed, and it was the full, deep, genuine laugh that she had produced in him from the beginning and that still surprised her, the way good things can still surprise you when you're not expecting them. He took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand over so their fingers fit together, and they sat like that in the fall evening while the sky went dark and the stars came up over the Texas flats. The Creston boys were history. Dale Hicks and Reeve Saunders had served their sentences, harder sentences than Eli's, without the mitigating factors of voluntary surrender and stopped crime, and had gone wherever men like that go when the law is finished with them, which was not Harlan Creek's concern. Cobb Whatley had, according to some report that reached Holt's office eventually, settled in New Mexico, and was working a cattle drive, which was the best anyone could hope for with a man like Whatley. Boyd remained a name without a last name in the town's memory, which suited nobody but also resolved nothing, and eventually resolved itself by simply being forgotten. Sheriff Holt retired in 1890, having held the job for 18 years, and Deputy Cal Morrison, who had grown considerably since the night Reeve Saunders had grabbed his wrist in the saloon, was elected sheriff in his place. At the retirement party in the town hall, organized primarily by Doris Aldridge, executed primarily by Martha Holt, made a short speech about law and community, and at the end of it he looked at Eli Fletcher across the room and nodded once, and Eli nodded back, and that was more than sufficient. Pete Sanderson died in the summer of 1891, in his chair outside the barber shop, which was exactly where and how anyone who knew Pete would have expected it. He was 81 years old and had been in Harlan Creek since before it was called Harlan Creek, and at his funeral Reverend Aldridge said he had been the town's memory and its conscience, and its weather vane all at once, which was accurate. After the service, Eli told Martha that Pete Sanderson was the first person in the world who had publicly understood what was happening between them, and Martha said, "He was also the first person to tell me to be afraid of you," and Eli said, "Were you ever?" And Martha looked at him and said, without a pause, "Not for a single moment." And he looked at her with the particular gray-eyed seriousness that always meant he was feeling something he didn't have words for, and she took his arm and they walked home through the summer streets of Harlan Creek together. Their third child, a boy they named Samuel, arrived in 1892, small and fierce and red-faced with the effort of existing, and he was the one who grew up to be most like his father in his silences and his precision with horses. Tommy, by then 6, was enormously proud and considerably less interested in the baby than he had expected to be, which shifted when Samuel was old enough to be reliably interesting. Rose, at 3, was entirely certain that Samuel had been brought home for her entertainment and treated him accordingly. Eli took Tommy out to the ranch for the first time when Tommy was 7, sitting the boy on Cannon, the bay horse with the white blaze, who had been with Eli since before Harlan Creek, and was aging now with the same patient dignity he had always had, and watching his son sit the horse with the easy straight back that Eli recognized as something that does not have to be learned, but simply surfaced. Tommy had his father's hands with horses, gentle and communicative, and Eli stood in the paddock and watched his son, and felt the particular pride that is neither loud nor small but simply central. Martha came out from the ranch house at some point in that afternoon and leaned on the paddock fence and watched them both, and Eli came and stood beside her, and Tommy rode Cannon in a slow circle with increasing confidence. "He's going to be good," Eli said. "He's already good," Martha said. "He's going to be exceptional." "That's your influence," Eli said. "That's your blood," Martha said. "I just contribute the opinions." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and they watched their son on the old bay horse in the afternoon light, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the Texas sky was doing what the Texas sky always does, which is be enormous and available and entirely indifferent to human arrangements, while the humans arrange themselves into happiness underneath it. The partnership with Corrigan became a full co-ownership in 1894, when Corrigan, who had no children of his own, made Eli and Martha his heirs, and effectively handed them the operation while retaining a quiet advisory interest for his remaining years. The ranch grew to proper scale 40 horses, a reputation that reached Fort Worth, and a training program that brought young riders from 3 counties to learn under Eli's eye. The Fletcher Ranch was, by the end of the century, one of the best-regarded small horse operations in West Texas. Martha's teaching had expanded. She had long since taken over the full-time position at the schoolhouse from Clara, who had moved to the Rowan farm and was occupied with the generous chaos of 5 children, and a farm that also required considerable management. The schoolhouse that had once needed its roof fixed was now a proper little building with fresh paint, and 3 grades of learning, and a shelf of books that Martha had acquired over the years through purchase, donation, and the occasional creative negotiation with Gerald Prout, who remained at his mercantile, and who remained the town's most thorough social narrator until the end of his days. On a September evening in 1895, Martha sat at the kitchen table in the house with the rose-lined fence, with the lamp lit and her grade papers in front of her, and the sounds of the house around her. Eli in the yard with Samuel, doing something that involved a length of rope and some questionable engineering. Rose upstairs writing in the journal she had recently acquired and treated as classified. Tommy out at the ranch staying late with a young horse that he was working through a particular problem with. The ordinary evening sounds of a life full of people and their activities. She set down her pen and looked at the lamp flame for a moment and thought about the stage from San Antonio, and the house with excellent bones and 2 struggling rose bushes, and the enormous grief she had carried then, and the modest promise she had made herself, which had turned out to be not modest at all, but the beginning of something she could not have predicted and could not have engineered, and which had required, in the end, only the willingness to keep looking directly at things instead of away from them. She heard Eli come in through the back door, the familiar sound of his boots and the specific quality of his movement through the house, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway, and she looked at him with the same direct gaze she had fixed on him across a Saturday market 12 years before. He looked back at her, and his face did the thing she loved most about it, the arrangement of itself into that warm, precise awareness that meant she had his complete attention. "Tommy's staying at the ranch," he said. "Samuel is asleep. Rose is writing her state secrets." He looked at the lamp and her papers. "Come sit on the porch." "I have papers," she said. "There'll still be papers tomorrow," he said. She put her pen down and stood up and followed him out to the porch, where the September night was finally beginning to cool, and the stars were coming up over the flat Texas horizon. The rose bushes along the fence were in their late-season bloom, fragrant and abundant, red and pink, and the original wild white of the 2 stubborn ones from Maple Street that had survived every transplanting and now grew with the comfortable authority of things that have been somewhere long enough to own it. She sat in her chair, and he sat in his, and they were quiet for a while in the way they had learned to be quiet together, the way that is its own conversation. The night sounds of the ranch property settled around them, the horses in the paddock and the distant sound of something moving in the brush and the first cricket of the evening. "Do you remember," Martha said, "that you told me the horizon kept moving, the one about having enough?" "I remember," he said. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "Because I was grading papers today from Samuel's age group, and one of the children wrote about what she wanted her life to look like when she was grown, and she wrote about a house and a family and a garden, which are very ordinary things, and I thought about how ordinary things are actually the most extraordinary, if you're paying attention." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, "When I came into Harlan Creek that first day and stood at the edge of the market, I was there to find out if there was anything worth taking." He said it with the honesty he had earned the right to, the honesty of a man who does not pretend his past was other than it was. "And I saw you looking at me and not looking away, and I thought, there is something here I have never encountered before." And what I hadn't encountered was someone looking at me and seeing, not the reputation, not the guns, not the caution, but the actual person underneath. He paused. "You looked at me like I was a person." "You were a person," Martha said simply. "Not everyone agreed," he said. "Then they weren't looking carefully enough," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, and she felt his thumb trace the familiar line across her knuckles, and the stars were overhead and the roses were fragrant, and in the paddock one of the horses moved and settled. "Eli," she said. "Martha," he said. "I'm glad you came down Maple Street," she said. "Both times." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, slow and deliberate. And when he looked at her across the arms of their porch chairs in the September dark, his gray eyes held everything. The cell bars and the letters and the letters and the market and the apple in the alley and Tommy on the bay horse and Rose's classified journal and Samuel asleep inside, and every ordinary extraordinary evening they had built together, all of it, right there. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The rose bushes bloomed until October, which they always did. The two original ones from Maple Street, the stubborn ones, the ones that had come through dry soil, and 2 transplantings, and 12 Texas summers, bloomed last and longest, the way stubborn things do, holding on past the reasonable season because no one had told them they were supposed to stop. Martha cut 2 of the last white blooms in the last week of October and put them in a glass jar on the windowsill, where they opened fully in the warm kitchen air, and kept them until the petals fell, one by one, onto the sill in the November morning light, each one a small, complete thing, having given everything it had. Outside, Eli brought Cannon in from the paddock, the old horse gentle and slow now, deep in his years but still steady, and brushed him down in the morning cold, talking to him quietly the way he always did, and the horse's breath came in small clouds in the November air, and the ranch lay quiet and good around him, and the house behind him held his family, and the whole of his life had the shape and weight of something real. He had walked into a sheriff's office and set his guns on a desk and told the truth about who he had been, and it had cost him a year and everything he'd thought he owned, and it had given him everything that mattered. That is the mathematics of certain lives, the accounting that does not balance until you are standing in the right place, looking at the right things. He put Cannon back in the paddock and went inside, stamping the cold from his boots at the door, and Martha looked up from the breakfast she was making and their eyes met across the warm kitchen, and it was the most ordinary possible moment and also the most extraordinary, because they both knew it and neither of them had to say so. Harlan Creek, Texas, remembered Eli Fletcher for a long time, not as the outlaw who had given the sheriff 4 years of trouble, but as the man who had walked into that bank without his guns drawn and talked 2 dangerous men down from the edge of something terrible, and then walked into the sheriff's office and put his guns on the desk and told the truth. It remembered him as Corrigan's partner, and later Corrigan's heir, and the man who could do more with a difficult horse in an hour than most men could in a week. It remembered him as Martha Doyle's husband, which was the identity he had claimed most deliberately, and which the town had come to regard, over time, with the combination of affection and respect it reserves for things that prove themselves true. Martha Doyle became Martha Fletcher and remained, in the town's memory, both the widow who had arrived on the Tuesday stage with her trunk and her grief and her 2 stubborn rose bushes, and the woman who had looked at Eli Fletcher across a Saturday market and not looked away, which had turned out, as her deliberate choices always did, to be exactly right. The roses on the fence bloomed every spring, and every spring the children and then the grandchildren measured the season by them, and the deep red ones that had started as seeds in 3 paper packets on a porch step in 1883 came up reliably and abundantly, year after year, which is what things do when they are planted in the right place and given the right care and allowed to grow toward the light they need.